I want to go back to how much trouble the carbon tax was in a year ago, because I think to see where we got to and where we might go in British Columbia, I think you got to really note this. That this time last year, the carbon tax was about to come into effect, July the 1st, and it was in serious political trouble in British Columbia for several reasons. And one of the reasons was that the government had simply done it. George referred to this chronic problem with our provincial government in general and our premier in particular, which is to simply, when he's made up his mind to do something, he just does it. Some politicians think that's when the selling starts, and you go out and persuade people you need to go this way, but we just did it, and of course premiers have the power to do these things, and so we got into this without really properly selling British Columbians on it. Remember, we had a premier who had reversed himself. He'd been at best a climate change inactive person, at most a denier for some time, so he made this reversal. He'd done this thing. He'd announced that the carbon tax was going to be revenue neutral to his colleagues, and he put that in the budget. But they had really gone ahead without actually communicating the revenue neutrality to people. A number of people who this time last year told me that they didn't think the $100 that the government gave back was going to begin to pay. I mean, pay it for one fill-up this time last year for a lot of vehicles. So they weren't even persuaded. A very prominent British Columbian who runs a polling company here asked a polling question whether people thought the $100 rebate made up for what they were going to pay in the carbon tax. And I said, well, what about all the tax cuts? He said, what tax cuts? The government, a Liberal cabinet minister said this, the government managed the unusual feat of cutting taxes without people knowing they've done it. This is not easy to do. And of course the other problem is the one alluded to already, which is that the government, in one of the least fortuitous tax increases since the British decided to hike the price of tea in 1776, managed to raise the price, the tax on gasoline, on the very day that gasoline prices peaked in all of human history, pretty much, right? There's that wonderful Vancouver gas prices chart, which when you go back and play it out last spring, it kind of watched this movie. Here, the day they enact the carbon tax, gasoline prices are here, they kind of climb, and there they go. $1.50 a liter, or whatever it was the day the tax took effect. So for all those reasons it was in trouble. And the other reason the tax was in trouble was because the New Democrats did something that the Liberals never imagined they would do. They opposed it. And this was a political party that had been calling for carbon taxes, that had really been the only voice in British Columbia calling for climate action for some time. And it never occurred to the Liberals as they crafted this thing that the New Democrats were going to run against it. Axe the tax. Very effective campaign. By the end of last summer and into the fall, the carbon tax is in serious political trouble. It's even worse now because you've seen the evidence in the opinion polls. The New Democrats had been trailing 14 points in polls, they'd been trailing 10 points, they'd trailed 12 points, they'd trailed 18 points. Suddenly all the pollsters in the province had got them either in a dead heat or even Angus Reid had them ahead. And so this problem lands on the government in the government caucus room last fall. And look, the Liberals had made their name cutting taxes. Remember they were running those wonderful ads? We cut 125 taxes, you know, or whatever the ad said, right? They spent a fortune telling us they'd cut all these taxes. Nobody cared about the 125 taxes they'd cut. It was the tax they'd invented and increased that got them into serious political trouble as well. So this problem ends up in the Liberal caucus room, and a bunch of people that, you know, weren't 100% persuaded that this climate action thing was a big problem anyway, although the Premier told them it was. And we're getting enormous heat from their constituents. Remember, the side of the political spectrum we're dealing with there, right? And everybody in British Columbia was sure they got a rotten deal from the carbon tax. Realtors thought they were paying more because, my God, they got to drive around the streets in those big fancy cars and sell houses. People in the north who don't begin to commute as much as a typical Lower Mainland resident does, they were paying more to drive their trucks than anybody in the Lower Mainland. Never mind 2-hour commutes in the Lower Mainland, sitting idling on the Port Mann Bridge, right? Everybody in British Columbia was paying more for this tax. This is like the Garrison Keillor story about all the kids being above average, right? Everybody in British Columbia was sure they were getting screwed by this tax. It ends up in the caucus room. The advice to the Premier is, look, you got to find a way of you got to water this thing down, or announce you're going to suspend the next iteration, or you're going to do something else. And basically it came down to the Premier saying, if you want to get rid of the carbon tax, you have to get rid of me. They didn't put that to a free vote. In the Liberal caucus room, they rarely do that in political parties, but there was no change in the carbon tax. They didn't announce that they were suspending it during the winter so that people wouldn't be paying more for home heating. They went ahead with it. The budget came in this year, and the carbon tax was still there. There was no announcement that they were going to suspend it the next installment, July 1st. So we got the opposition, we're going to an election, fixed election date, right? It's not like you can change the date and play around with it. The election's coming, and we get to the NDP released their election platform, and even though there was some debate within the NDP about whether or not this had been the greatest policy change they'd ever taken, it was pretty hard to argue. They closed the gap in the polls. They found themselves talking to people that they'd never really heard much from for a long time. They're talking to people that, you know, some of them weren't all that welcome. Carol James said at one point she's kind of tired of hearing from the climate change deniers, right? She's going to phone up and say, oh, you know, there's this chart, this hockey stick thing and everything. She suddenly found her hearing from people that read the editorial page of the National Post. But in any event, the NDP's #1 promise in their platform, at least the first 10-day campaign, was we're going to get rid of the carbon tax. So we went at it again. And for about the first 10 days of the election campaign, the carbon tax is this big issue again, right? But the NDP hit a backlash. And it wasn't that New Democrats hadn't had disagreements over environmental issues before. But very often in past BC elections, they had been talking. They were the party that environmentalists talked to. And suddenly you had some, not all by any means, some prominent environmentalists making a big deal about the NDP having gotten this issue wrong. And it was a range of comments, and some of them were fairly prominent. David Suzuki being extremely prominent. I guess probably the closest thing to a secular saint this country's produced on that issue. That's Bork Berman. Very well-timed letter of resignation from the NDP that just happened to come out about day 4 of the election campaign and published in the Vancouver Sun. I don't know how we obtained that. It's one of those mysteries of journalism. And so on. And if you remember the election campaign, the arc of it, the New Democrats about 10 days into the campaign started to change the emphasis of their campaign. And the carbon tax wasn't talked about as much. We talked a lot more about run-of-the-river power. James turned in a wonderful performance in the election debate. She finished strong, and you got the election result we did. Was the carbon tax a factor? And I'm going to end on this, and I'm going to take questions. Well, I think, first of all, imagine what we'd be saying if the Liberals had lost the election. I mean, imagine what we'd be saying. And the other thing you want to do is you want to go back and cover that debate through, especially this time last year. A lot of the people who didn't like the carbon tax made predictions. Democrats made predictions. Liberals who didn't like the carbon tax made predictions. And some of the things they predicted are this: that it was going to cost the government support in the north. It was going to cost them support in the interior. Rural British Columbia, they were going to lose seats over this. The Conservatives started up a provincial party. The Conservatives ran hard against the carbon tax. That was going to cost the Liberal support. Because even if you were on the left and you were going to vote for the NDP for their reasons, well, you'd have this right-wing party you could vote for. That was going to split the vote. So there's a whole series of predictions. It was going to affect them in the suburbs because people had huge commutes and they were paying the carbon tax. So let's go through the election results, shall we? 3 seats in the Prince George area. The Liberals held them before the election. They won them all, solidly. They won the 2 seats in the Peace River country, the part of British Columbia that's mostly like Alberta and has the oil and gas industry, right? They won the 2 seats in Kamloops. They held them both. They won the southeast of British Columbia, another part of the province that, you know, is so much like Alberta, it runs on their time. They had to get a Conservative, the leader of the Conservative Party, and a Democrat, both running against the carbon tax. The local Liberal took 51% of the vote. He won the seat, more votes than he'd ever taken before in that riding, except in 2001. Okanagan, again, lots of retired Albertans there. Liberals took all 7 seats, north to south, every single seat in Alberta, right? And then you go, there's 2 seats in the province that changed hands where you might say carbon tax was a factor. But One is Stikine in the northwest. No incumbent running there. New Democrats won it. That is a rural seat. That's a northern seat. Might have been a factor. But then the Liberals took one of the Caribou seats back from the New Democrats. And again, that's an interior seat. You come to the suburbs. No seats changed hands of any significance. The Liberals picked up the new seat in the Fraser Valley. They picked up the new seat in Surrey. They picked up the new seat in the Tri-Cities area. They picked up the new seat in the city of Vancouver. The only new seat in the House that the New Democrats won was the one on Vancouver Island. The Conservatives, this is going to be his big factor, this backlash over the carbon tax. Conservatives took up to 20% of the vote in one interior riding. They took 10%, they took 17%, they took 16%. Liberals won every riding where the Conservatives ran better than 5% of the vote. Delta South, the Liberals lost the seat. I think local issues, and 32 votes lost. I don't think that's an issue. Burnaby, the Liberals lost the seat. Again, I think a local issue regarding the prison. A very well organized NDP campaign. I don't think the deciding factor there was the carbon tax. And finally, you get to the seat in the city of Vancouver, Fairview. That's an interesting one. I would say that may be the only seat that really, locally, the carbon tax cost anybody anything, and the carbon tax certainly cost, well, I think a factor, cost the New Democrats that seat. Vancouver Fairview was the seat Gregor Robertson held, that he won. In 2005, Robertson stepped down to become mayor of Vancouver. The Democrats, it's true, won the seat in the by-election. They lost it in the general election. I ask you to remember Gregor's great introduction delivered to the premier in town here. Let's hear it for the carbon tax. 3 cheers for the carbon tax. And he managed to get around to endorsing the NDP candidate, and that went in the last day of the campaign. The final result of the election, pretty much the same result as the 2005 election. So I don't think the carbon tax issue really cost the Liberals anything, and I think it doubly reinforced, and this is where we're going to leave it, I think it doubly reinforced the Premier's certainty that he was right on this issue. Because not only did he do it, but he faced down his own colleagues on the issue. And they improved their standing in the legislature. Gap between the parties is 13 still seats, but they managed to hold their own. They picked up the new seats. It did divide the New Democrats from some of their supporters. It did cause the New Democrats anguish. I think you're going to see over the next 18 months that the debate over what to do about the carbon tax will be in the NDP. How do we adapt? How does the party adapt more to the kind of agenda that I think George Heyman has laid out tonight, which is how do you start talking about equity and using some of the proceeds from the carbon tax for transit and things like that. But I think that debate is going to take place more in the opposition, how to reposition themselves on the carbon tax. Then on the government side, the next installment of the carbon tax takes place on July the 1st. The subsequent ones are on July the 1st every year. Canada Day is a good day to raise taxes. And of course it is revenue neutral, even if people don't 100% accept that. The big challenge for the future, and I agree very much with what both Nancy and George said, the big challenge for British Columbia is how do we fit into the American cap and trade system. British Columbia got into this Western Planning Initiative thing very early. I think with the best of intentions, the intention right from the beginning, I'll say this, the provincial government recognized the potential for a cap and trade system to become a non-tariff barrier. And they were very concerned to get into it so that not only that we could sell carbon offsets, but that we wouldn't face penalties, because we've been fighting, we have enough things to fight about the Americans for penalties anyway. So there's lots of challenges going ahead, but I think the carbon tax, as Carol James has also conceded, is here to stay. And in that respect, you know, we often talk about in my business about politicians always doing things for cynical reasons and short-term reasons, and I still think this is an example. I have many examples where Gordon Campbell hasn't done the right thing, but I think this is an example where a politician adopted a policy first at considerable political risk, and he managed to pull it off. I look forward to your questions.
Vaughn's made a compelling argument for better communications, and maybe a touch on timing as well. So we've got a couple of time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, well, maybe this is best left for the next speaker, but in contrast, the great thing about living in British Columbia, especially if you come back from the east, is that it doesn't matter what the rest of the country does, because life's good here anyways. So to preface that and to put the context in it,
but we're not smug about it, okay?
But it doesn't matter if we're smug. So he did a great thing, but we can compare and contrast with another Liberal, who's Stéphane Dion, who has poisoned the well for federal politics for, I think, for some time. I wonder if you want to comment on that, and whether this election has any effect on that, and any effect on Michael and I not picking up on.
I am going to leave that to Jeffrey, but I just do want to comment on the extremely bizarre situation here last fall, because you're right. While the British Columbia government was deciding not to abandon the carbon tax, it was under siege on a daily basis here in British Columbia. And by mutual agreement between the federal Conservatives and the provincial Liberals, they pretty much agreed to pretend that our carbon tax wasn't a federal Liberal carbon tax. And likewise, the Campbell Liberals would go, well, you know, that's a completely different thing. I mean, that's just a totally different tax. We're not going to get into that, right? So there was that kind of odd arrangement that sometimes prevails I'll tell you, I was at the swearing in of our new independent member of the legislature today, Vicky Huntington, and during the scrum she made a very careful point of pointing out that she is a federal Conservative, but she is not a provincial BC Conservative. So this kind of, I am not now, never having been a member of the party in denial that goes on a lot of them.
One more, but
thanks. Great presentation. You noted that the process by which the BC carbon tax was adopted was a really closed-door process. And I'm just wondering if you think that the same result could have been achieved with a more stakeholder-driven process. If we could have come out to the same policy that we think is actually a really good policy.
I do actually. I think that a more public process would have certainly cleared away some of the real communications problems with the policy. And I think it might have, the only problem with it is it might have taken longer. I mean, remember, the Premier did not have his epiphany until just after Christmas, or before Christmas in 2006. So we got our first climate action budget in 2007, and then we got our carbon tax budget in 2008. And so if you had a year of consultation, we might be that far behind. And of course, that's why you always hear from governments that we got to get going on this stuff. Right? But no, I think a more consultative process would have, and you might have gotten a mix too on the revenue neutrality thing. You might have been able to have part of your revenue neutrality going to the 400 buses that we need in the local mainland and things like that. So it wasn't entirely a form of taxes being given that.
well, thank you. I think we'll have time for more questions in a few minutes. Our next presenter is Jeffrey Sampson, who also doesn't need a lot of introduction. He's an award-winning, highly regarded journalist in national affairs columns with the Globe and Mail, and has recently authored a book with Nick Burrard and Mark Burrard entitled Moderator Meeting Canada's Climate Change Challenge. And in that book, they outline a number of practical solutions, and so it'll be great to hear your views on how the election has influenced political approaches to carbon taxes and climate change in both Canada and North America, and hopefully we can get some of your advice on and thoughts on some simple solutions.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. Does the British Columbia election on the carbon tax have an impact on the rest of the country? The short, sweet answer is no. As Nancy was saying, the reports of the death of the carbon tax are greatly exaggerated. I don't think they are. There were a particular set of circumstances in British Columbia that contributed to the creation of the tax and to the election, which Vaughn has just analyzed. But the carbon tax in the rest of the country, or a carbon tax in the rest of the country, is dead politically for the foreseeable future. It's possible that many years from now, if we've exhausted all the alternatives and they haven't worked, we may yet turn back to a carbon tax. And I say that as someone who favored the carbon tax, both intellectually and for a variety of other reasons, and I still do. It is the clearest, it is the simplest, it is the most direct way of pricing carbon. And pricing carbon in one form or another is the indispensable prerequisite for any serious attack on the challenge of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not saying it's the only policy, but it is the indispensable minimum. But because the carbon tax is clear, and it is simple, and it is direct, and it is paid by individuals, it's also an easy target. And we saw that in the green shift of the Liberal Party. Now, you can say, as many people have, well, the spokesman killed the idea. We'll never know who else might have been able to sell that particular policy. Presumably that person could have sold it better. But the lessons that are being drawn politically in the circles that I know something about from that episode are as follows. The Liberal Party doesn't want any part of a carbon tax for the foreseeable future. The Conservative Party didn't want it before, it certainly doesn't want it now. And the Democratic Party, like the provincial Democratic Party, doesn't want a carbon tax for a variety of reasons. So there's no support among the three great national parties for this. The Bloc Québécois is fine with a carbon tax because Quebec's emissions are so low. And they're low not because Quebecers are more morally superior than we are, although they sometimes think they are. It's because they have hydro. So the cap and trade system is much easier politically because it is less visible, it is less clear, it is less direct, it is frankly very confusing, and therefore it is politically the preferable option. It is deemed by people to be something that they will not have to pay, which is why the New Democratic Party was so enthusiastic, one of the reasons why the New Democratic Party was so enthusiastic for it. Now, I heartily approved, and I was there the day that Vaughn remembers when the carbon tax budget came out under Finance Minister Taylor, as she then was. And I wrote one of my long string of rather brilliantly foolish columns in which I said that I thought that this budget would be the template as the years went on for how to deal with carbon policy in the same way that the CCF policy on publicly financed Medicare became over time. It took a long time, we should remember, for that policy to seep its way across the country and become the template for national policies. I thought that was the case for British Columbia. I thought it was an exceptionally well-designed public policy, one of the best, and I saluted completely the courage of the Premier and Ms. Taylor and others. However, I was wrong. It isn't going to be the template anywhere else in the province, in the country. Some very significant things have changed, not the least of which was the defeat of the green shift and the political reaction that I described to you. Where are we, therefore, nationally? Well, we could have, over the last decade, or from the time that we signed and then ratified the Kyoto Protocol, we could have developed in Canada some kind of coherent approach to the problem of emissions. But we have spectacularly failed to do so. As a consequence, emissions have gone up faster than in any country that signed Kyoto, faster than in the United States under George W. Bush, I like to remind Canadians. And we still don't have anything remotely like a coherent national policy. Provinces are going their own way. So British Columbia is going its way with a carbon tax. No other province is going to go that way. Some elements of Alberta's approach Nancy talked about. Some provinces are introducing their own cap and trade systems. Some are joining with border states in the Western Carbon Initiative, etc. All going in different ways. The Harper government announced a policy based on intensity reductions and said the regulations would be published in 2008. This week, the Minister of the Environment said they'd be ready in 2011. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. And so what is happening in Canada is that having failed ourselves to develop a domestic framework, and really not even having tried, this vacuum is now being filled by the United States. So our climate change policy is more or less being made by what's going to happen in the United States. We are going to essentially align our policies with whatever emerges as best we can with those in the United States. And we have seen evidence of this already. Several weeks ago, the President announced new vehicle tailpipe emission standards for automobiles by 2016 in the United States, and the Harper government said we will follow along because we have a integrated car manufacturing industry. There is no appetite whatsoever anywhere in the American political system for a tax on carbon, or for any tax for that matter in the United States. And so since we are going to have to craft our national policies in accordance with what emerges from the United States, we are not going to be using any kind of a national carbon tax, even though, as I said, intellectually I think that's the most appropriate. Similarly, if you go beyond the United States, the European Union is not interested in carbon taxes. There are a couple of countries that have vehicle taxes, or gasoline taxes, I should